The string quartet was playing something sweeping and romantic, the kind of music that costs more per hour than most people earn in a week, and my sister Lily was standing at the altar in $50,000 of custom silk, looking like everything our parents had ever wanted her to be. While my ex-fiancé David was holding her hands, smiling, looking at her the way he used to look at me, before I understood that he looked at everyone that way, and it had never once meant what I thought it meant. My parents were in the front row, dabbing their eyes with monogrammed handkerchiefs. 500 guests in their finest clothes filled every pew of the Crystal Cathedral, the kind of venue that exists specifically for the kind of people who believe the size of a wedding correlates directly with the depth of a love. "If anyone objects to this union," the priest said, his voice carrying beautifully through the vaulted space, "speak now." The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the cathedral slammed open. The sound rolled through that room like a physical thing, turning 500 heads in unison, and I walked down the center aisle in a blood-red designer suit, flanked by 4 members of private security who had been briefed very precisely on exactly how much chaos to allow and exactly how much to contain. While my mother's hand flew to her mouth, I watched her face do the thing it had always done when I appeared somewhere inconvenient, the rapid recalculation of whether this could be managed and how fast. Lily turned from the altar and went the color of the silk she was wearing. "I object," I said, and let my voice carry all the way to the priest, all the way to the vaulted ceiling, all the way to every phone that was already being raised in that room, because some moments deserve witnesses, and I had spent 5 years making sure this one would have them. "Get her out," Lily screamed, pointing at me with a hand that still wore my engagement ring. "She's a convict. She's INS sane. Security. Get her out of here. Right now." I took a sip of the champagne I'd picked up from a passing tray on my way down the aisle. Set the glass down on the end of the nearest pew, unhurried. "I own this cathedral, actually," I said. "Bought it 2 weeks ago through a shell company. And I also bought your fashion brand this morning. 51%. Majority shareholder. Effective 9 a.m. Lily's mouth opened and closed around a sound that didn't quite become a word. "That's," I said, pulling a small remote from the inside pocket of my jacket. "Before we discuss the business, I think your guests should see what you and David were doing the night you sent me to prison. To explain what happened next, I need to take you back 5 years, back to a rainy night when I still believed my family was worth dying for. I was 24 years old the night Lily came home covered in someone else's blood. I remember the sound of the front door opening, that specific late-night creak of it, and then her voice not forming words yet, just sound. The kind of sound that bypasses language entirely and goes straight for the part of the brain that knows, before anything else, that something has gone terribly wrong. I came downstairs to find her sitting on the kitchen floors, still in her going-out clothes, her hands shaking in her lap, a dark stain across the front of her dress that the kitchen light made look almost black. "Lily," I said, crouching down in front of her, my hands going to her shoulders automatically. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "I hit someone," she said. The voice was completely flat, the specific flatness of a person in shock who hasn't yet processed what their own mouth is saying. "I was driving your car. I hit someone and I didn't stop." The kitchen went very quiet around that sentence. "Where?" I said. "Where did this happen? Did you call anyone?" "An ambulance, the police. I drove home," Lily said. I just drove home. I was reaching for my phone when my parents appeared in the doorway. Well, my mother first, then my father, and I understood, in the moment before either of them spoke, from the way they looked at each other rather than at Lily, that they had heard this already, probably from upstairs, probably from the moment she came through the door, and had been having a different conversation than the one I was about to have. "Put the phone down," my father said. "Dad, someone might still be alive out there. We have to put IT down." His voice low and final, the voice he used when a decision had already been made in a room I hadn't been invited into. "Sit down, Nora. We need to talk." My mother cried for what felt like an hour, not for the person who had been left on the road, for Lily, for what prison would do to her, for how fragile she was, for how she wouldn't survive a single night in a cell, for how Nora who was strong, Nora who had always been the resilient one, would understand better than anyone why this had to be handled carefully. "You're the older sister," my mother said, taking my hands in hers, looking at me with the specific expression she had always used, when she needed something from me that she knew she had no right to ask for. "You have to protect her. You've always protected her." "This isn't a scraped knee," I said. Someone is dead, Mom. Someone is lying on the road right now because you were driving, my father said quietly from across the table. You borrowed the car to go to that event downtown. You'd been drinking. You came home and told us what happened. That's the story. I looked at him for a long time. That's not what happened, I said. I know, he said, and the awful, matter-of-fact calm in his voice was somehow worse than if he'd been angry. It is what happened. I looked at Lily. She was watching me from across the table with wet eyes and something underneath the tears that I didn't fully recognize until much later. Something that looked less like gratitude and more like relief. The relief of someone who has been waiting to find out if the plan is going to work. Please, Lily whispered. Nora, please. I wouldn't survive it. You know I wouldn't. David was there too that night, standing near the kitchen doorway, quiet, his arms folded, watching all of this with an expression I had read, at the time, as supportive concern. I'll wait for you, he told me, later, alone, when my parents had taken Lily upstairs and left us in the kitchen, with the weight of what I was about to do settling over everything. However long it takes, I'll be here. I turned myself in the next morning. The judge gave me 5 years. I stood in that courtroom in a borrowed suit, listening to the sentence, and I thought, with the specific, strange clarity that extreme moments sometimes produce, that 5 years wasn't forever. That David would wait, that my family would write, visit, hold everything together until I got home. That this was a sacrifice with a defined endpoint, and at the end of it I would still have the people I'd made it for. I want to be honest about how naive that sounds now. At the time, it didn't feel naive. It felt like love. The first 6 months they came every weekend. My mother brought food, my father brought news from home, David brought himself in his hands and the specific warmth of being looked at by someone who knew you before the prison uniform. Then the visits became every other week, then once a month. Then my mother called on a Sunday to say the drive was getting difficult, the traffic, her back, and I told her I understood, because I had always told everyone in my family I understood, even when I didn't. David's calls stretched further apart through the second year. He was busy, he said. Work was intense. He thought about me all the time, he said, and I believed him with the particular desperation of someone who can't afford not to. By the 3rd year, the calls had stopped completely. I told myself there was an explanation. I built it carefully, the way you build something you know might not hold, but need to stand long enough to get you through the next day. The explanation arrived in a different form than I'd been building toward. A guard named Officer Cummings had been quietly kind to me across 3 years in a specific, careful way prison staff sometimes are with inmates they've decided to see as people. She appeared at my cell door one evening during lockdown with a glossy magazine folded open, and something in her face told me, before I even looked at it, that she'd been deciding whether to show me this for a while. I thought you should know, she said, rather than find out some other way. The photograph took up most of the page. Lily on a yacht, sun bright, wearing a white sundress and a diamond ring I recognized by the setting before I registered what it meant. David beside her, one arm around her waist, both of them caught mid-laugh by whoever had taken the shot. The caption below identified them as the co-founders of a new luxury fashion label, recently launched to significant industry buzz, backed by a substantial startup fund. Top fund, the business capital I'd been saving for 4 years before the arrest, sitting in a trust account that had my name on it and, apparently, enough legal ambiguity built in by a lawyer I'd trusted that 2 people with forged signatures and bad intentions had found a way to clean it out while I was inside. I read the caption 3 times. Then I folded the magazine closed, handed it back to Officer Cummings, and sat down on the edge of my mattress. I want to be accurate about what happened in me in that moment because I've thought about it many times since, and I want to describe it correctly. I didn't fall apart. I didn't cry. I had cried plenty in the first year, for the person who died on that road, for the family I'd thought I was protecting, for David, for the business I'd been going to build. I'd processed grief in all the ways that grief gets processed in a room with no privacy and too much time. What happened in that moment was different. Quieter. Something that had been soft in me, some last remaining capacity to excuse or minimize what my family had done, simply closed. Like a door, not slammed, just shut. Quietly and finally, with a click, I felt more than heard. They hadn't just let me go. They had waited for me to go, and then they had taken everything I'd left behind. I sat there for a long time in the dark after lights out, thinking about 5 years, about a business fund, and about a diamond ring in a photograph, and about what I was going to do with the remaining 2 years I had left in this place to prepare for what came after. The riot started on a Tuesday afternoon in the yard, the way most things in that prison started, fast and without warning, a disagreement that had been building for weeks finally finding the specific spark it needed. I'd learned by year 3 to read the yard the way sailors learn to read weather. The particular stillness before something broke, the shifting of bodies into alignments that meant something was coming. I'd learned to stay close to walls to keep my back covered, to trust the 2 women I'd carefully and selectively allowed close enough to call something adjacent to allies. I saw it happening from across the yard, a group of sex moving with the coordinated intent of people who had been planning this particular moment, converging on a corner near the east wall where an older woman had been sitting alone. Madame Rosa. I'd seen her around the facility for most of my 3rd year, placed at our wing for reasons that involved tax statutes and white-collar investigations that the other inmates discussed in terms that made it clear she was both extremely powerful on the outside and, for reasons of pure novelty, largely left alone on the inside. She kept to herself. She read. She watched everything with the specific, unhurried attention of someone who has never once in her life needed to pretend to understand a room faster than she actually did. 6 women with a sharpened piece of metal and a grievance I didn't know the specifics of had decided that her particular piece needed ending. I was moving before I'd consciously decided it too, the way the body sometimes acts before the mind finishes the argument with itself. I got between the weapon and the woman it was aimed at. I felt the impact before I fully understood it, a sharp, hot line across my left forearm, and then the guards were there, and then the yard was noise and chaos, and then I was on the ground looking at the sky, which was a very particular shade of grey that afternoon, and thinking, with the odd clarity that pain sometimes produces, that I had made it this far by making careful decisions, and this one had made before I could be careful about it at all. The Rosa's voice was the first one I recognized through the noise. "Get her to the infirmary," she said, with the quiet, absolute authority of someone used to being obeyed in rooms where no one technically had to obey her. Right now, someone listened. Someone always listens to that voice. The infirmary smelled like disinfectant and old paint, the specific combination that exists nowhere else on Earth except institutional medical rooms that were last renovated several decades ago and have absorbed everything that has happened in them since. I woke up to the sound of a page turning. Madame Rosa was sitting in the chair beside my bed reading, in no particular hurry, a book I didn't recognize. She was dressed the same way she always was in the yard. Neat, understated, the kind of clothing that looks ordinary until you understand fabric well enough to know it isn't. She looked up and she heard me move and closed the book without marking her page, which told me, somehow, that she hadn't been reading it very closely. "You're going to need stitches," she said. "They've already done it. You were out for a while. You looked down at my left forearm. White gauze neatly wrapped. The pain underneath it was the specific deep throb that meant it was going to hurt considerably more once the shock fully wore off." "Why were they going after you?" I said, because even half-conscious that was the question I'd wanted answered since I crossed the yard. "Old business," Rosa said without particular concern. "The kind that travels into places it shouldn't. I've been managing it. Didn't look very managed." "No," she agreed, and something moved briefly across her face that might have been amusement. It didn't, at that particular moment. She was quiet for a few seconds, looking at me with the specific attention of someone who spent decades in rooms full of people and developed a very precise sense of which ones are worth her time. "You didn't know me," she said. "You had no reason to do that. There were 6 of them," I said, "and 1 of you. That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have," I said. "I don't let 6 go after 1. It's a rule I made for myself early in here, and it's kept me cleaner than most of the alternatives." Rosa studied me for another moment. Then she nodded, once the way people nod when a decision they've been approaching has finally been made. "How long do you have left?" she said. 14 months. "And then what?" I looked at the ceiling for a moment. The paint up there was the same institutional beige as everything else in the facility, marked with water stains in the upper left corner that had been there since my first week. "I don't know yet," I said. "I had a plan once. It belonged to a different version of my life." "Tell me about it," Rosa said. So I did, not because I decided to trust her. Not yet. but because I was in a hospital bed in a women's prison with 14 months left on a sentence I hadn't earned, and the plan I described felt very far away, and sometimes the only way to remember that something was real is to say it out loud to another person, I told her about the business fund, the fashion concept I'd been developing before the arrest, the 5 years of watching someone else build an empire on the money, and the idea I'd spent years putting together. Rosa listened without interrupting, which was, I would come to understand, one of her most deliberately deployed skills. "You have a good mind," she said when I finished. "I could tell that from watching you in here. You navigate complex social environments with a level of precision most people never develop." "Prison teaches that faster than most things," I said. "Yes," she agreed, "it does, which is one of the things people who've never been inside fail to understand about the people who have." She paused. "I get out in 4 months. Tax matter mostly resolved. My lawyers were thorough, if somewhat slow. When I'm out, I'm going to be looking to diversify into fashion investment. It's an area I've been circling for some time." I looked at her. "And when you're released," she continued, "I'd like you to come work with me." Not for me. With me. There's a meaningful difference, and I want to be precise about it from the beginning. "We don't know anything about me," I said. "Not really. I know you stepped between a weapon and a stranger without stopping to calculate the personal cost," Rosa said. "In my experience, that tells me more about a person than most due diligence processes. I could have made a terrible business decision just now," I said. "Financially speaking." "You could have," she agreed, and this time the thing that moved across her face was definitely amusement. "I prefer to think of it as the best interview either of us has ever conducted." I looked at the gauze on my arm, at water stain on the ceiling, at the 14 months between me and a world that had rearranged itself entirely in my absence. "Okay," I said, "tell me what you're thinking." Rose was released 4 months before me, as scheduled, and the facility returned to its ordinary rhythms without her particular stillness in the yard. But the silence between us didn't resume the way silences do when someone simply leaves. She had contacts inside, legal contacts, the kind that made certain communications permissible, and I received, over the following months, enough information to begin understanding the full shape of what had been done to me while I wasn't looking. The financial records came first. The Rose's investigators had been working on them since the week she got out, and what they found took less time than I expected, because, it turned out, David had been careless in a way that confident people who've never been caught for anything tend to be careless. The signatures on a trust fund liquidation documents were forged, plainly, in a way that a competent handwriting analyst dismantled in an afternoon. My parents had notarized the transfer, which made them not just witnesses to the fraud, but participants in it. The CCTV footage took longer. A corner store camera positioned to capture the front of the shop and the street beyond it had recorded that intersection the night of the accident. The original footage had never been formally entered into evidence because no one had looked for it, because the investigation had been closed quickly on the basis of a voluntary confession from a credible suspect who had surrendered herself without complication. The Rose's fixer found the backup file on a server that the store owner had never deleted. 3 years of continuous footage archived automatically, sitting there the entire time. I watched it on a tablet, through a permissions arrangement Rose's lawyers had negotiated, sitting on my prison mattress 14 months after I'd handed myself in for a crime committed by the people in that footage. Lily was driving. That was exactly what I had expected to see. What I hadn't expected was David. He was in the passenger seat, clearly visible even through the low-resolution grain of a corner store security camera. I watched him lean forward after the impact, watched Lily's hands go to her face, watched him put his hand over hers on the steering wheel and then pull it back toward him, steering, still moving, and I understood, watching it, that the decision to leave hadn't been made in a moment of panic. It had been made in the passenger seat, immediately, deliberately, by the man who had stood in my kitchen and told me he would wait for me. I watched the footage twice. Then I put the tablet face down on the mattress and sat in the dark for a long time, and not with grief, past grief, but with the specific, freezing clarity of someone who finally understands the complete shape of the thing that happened to them. David hadn't just failed to stop what Lily did. He had covered the victim, according to the investigators' additional findings. A witness report that had been buried in the case file, and driven the car the final 3 blocks home while Lily was too shocked to function. He had planned the cover-out before the car was out of the intersection, and then he had stood in my kitchen, looked me in the eyes, and told me he would wait. My release date arrived on a grey Wednesday morning, the kind of weather that doesn't celebrate anything. I walked through the processing corridor with a small box of personal items they returned to you on the way out. The same items that had gone into storage on the way in 5 years earlier, now sitting in a cardboard box that felt both familiar and entirely foreign, like objects from a different person's life. The gate opened. My parents were waiting on the other side. I stopped for a moment when I saw them, not from emotion or not from the emotions they were hoping for, from the simple, precise observation that they were standing slightly apart from each other in the way of people who have been having a disagreement, and that neither of them moved toward me when the gate opened. My mother was holding an envelope. "We wanted to catch you before you made any decisions," my father said, which was an interesting way to open the first conversation in 14 months. My mother held out the envelope. "There's some money in there, enough to get started somewhere quiet." I didn't take the envelope. "Lily's wedding is in 3 weeks, my father said. "We need you to understand that your presence would be very difficult for the family, for Lily specifically." "Given everything," I repeated. "People know about the conviction," my mother said, and I could hear underneath the careful phrasing the actual sentence she was trying to avoid saying. "People know about you, and you are an embarrassment we have already managed the narrative around, and your reappearance complicates that management. It wouldn't be fair to Lily to have that at her wedding. She's worked so hard." I looked at my mother for a long moment, at the envelope in her hand, and my father's expression, which was the expression of a man who knows he's doing something wrong and has made peace with doing it anyway. "She's worked so hard," I said, very quietly, "with my money. Nora, I'm not going to make a scene," I said. "I'm not going to show up somewhere I'm not wanted and cause problems." My mother's shoulders dropped slightly with relief. "But not because you ask me to," I said, "because I have my own timeline, and I'll be there when I'm ready." I walked past them. A black car was idling at the curb, 20 feet down from the gate. The kind of vehicle whose model communicates, without any other signage, that the person inside is not worried about parking tickets or time. Rosa's driver had the door open before I reached him. I got in without looking back. Rosa's penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a building in the financial district that had no signage on the exterior, and a lobby that looked, at first glance, deliberately less impressive than what the elevator opened into. She was waiting in the maid's sitting room with coffee already poured and a stack of folders on the table beside her that I understood, from the thickness of them, represented a significant quantity of recently completed work. "How was it?" she said, meaning the release, meaning my parents, meaning all of it. "Exactly what I expected," I said, which made it easier than I thought it would be. She nodded and pushed one of the folders toward me. I opened it. The first page was the CCTV, still I'd already seen on the tablet, but printed now, high resolution, the kind of clarity that removed any remaining ambiguity about who was in the car and what they were doing. The following pages were the financial forensics, laid out in the specific, navigable format of someone who has presented evidence to hostile rooms many times and knows how to structure it for maximum comprehension in minimum time. The final section was something I haven't seen yet, a series of corporate documents, share registries, ownership structures for the fashion label. "Lily's company," Rosa said, watching me read. "It's grown faster than she deserved, given what it's built on. That fast growth leaves gaps, especially when the founders are better at spending money than understanding how their cap table works." "How much is available?" I said. 51% is a curable," Rosa said, "through 4 separate shell acquisitions, timed across an 8-week window. Nothing that would trigger a mandatory disclosure before the final consolidation. By the time anyone with standing to object understands what's happened, it will be done. And the cost. Within the parameters of what we discussed," she said. "Consider it an investment. I get a return eventually. You get your name back." I looked at the share registry for a long time. "She's going to be wearing my ring at that wedding," I said. "Not to anyone in particular." "I know," Rosa said. "And David's going to be at that altar like he's got something worth standing in front of." "I know that too." I closed the folder, picked up the coffee. It was very good coffee, the kind that exists at a level of quality I had genuinely forgotten about over 5 years of institutional alternatives. "Start the acquisitions Monday," I said. "I want everything consolidated before the wedding date." Rosa picked up her own cup. "I already have." The 8 weeks move with a particular quality of time that is both extremely slow in individual days and astonishingly fast in aggregate. The Roses team worked with the precision of people for whom this kind of transaction was not extraordinary, and I worked alongside them, learning the mechanics of the deal, not as a passenger, but as a participant, because I had decided that if I was going to take back what was mine, I was going to understand every component of how it was done. The final acquisition flew on a Thursday evening, 2 days before the wedding. I sat in Rose's conference room, watching the confirmation come through on a laptop, and felt something settle into place in my chest. Something that had been waiting for a very long time to find somewhere to land. 51%, Rose's lead attorney confirmed, looking up from the screen. You are the majority shareholder of record as of 6:43 p.m. And the footage, I said. Ready, Rosa said. The Cathedral's AV system has been accessed through the vendor contract. The flash drive will connect to the main display feed, all screens, simultaneously. I nodded. The arrest warrants, I said. Filed this afternoon, Rosa's attorney said. Fill out this afternoon, Rosa's attorney said. Vehicular manslaughter, conspiracy to obstruct justice, financial fraud. Well, executed your signal. I sat with all of that for a moment, the full architecture of it, every piece in place, every thread pulled to exactly the right tension. Okay, I said, then I think we're ready. The morning of the wedding, I woke at 5:30, took a long shower, and stood in Rosa's dressing room looking at a blood-red suit that had been made for exactly one occasion and would never need to be worn for another. I dressed slowly and deliberately, the way you dress when you want to remember exactly how something feels. Rosa appeared in the doorway when I was almost done. How are you? She said. Ready, I said, and meant it completely, for the first time in longer than I could accurately measure. Victor, Rosa's driver, had the Maybach at the curb at 8:15. I came downstairs with the flash drive in my inside pocket and the specific stillness of someone who has spent 5 years building toward a single morning at his final, actually in it. I got in. The Cathedral, I told Victor. Yes, Miss Nora, he said, and pulled into traffic. I looked out the window at a city that had moved on without me for 5 years, already relearning the shape of it, already planning what came next. The Cathedral was 40 minutes away. I used every one of them. The Cathedral was exactly as expensive as 500 wedding invitations imply. White lilies banked every pew for an entrance to the altar, the kind of floral arrangement that requires a team and a budget most people spend on rent for several years. The stained glass threw colored light across 500 guests in their finest, and a string quartet in a corner was playing something that cost significantly more per hour than the venue probably charged per square foot. I stood outside the heavy mahogany doors for exactly 30 seconds, not from hesitation, from the simple, deliberate decision to arrive at the specific moment that Reese reached the objection clause which Rosa's contact inside the venue had confirmed via text 40 minutes ago. Timing, in this as in most things, was everything. My phone buzzed once. The word, now. I pushed both doors open. The sound they made rolling back on their hinges carried beautifully through that space, designed as it was for acoustics, and 500 heads turned, with the kind of unified precision that only genuine shock produces. I walked down the center aisle in the blood-red suit, unhurried, my security flanking me at a distance that communicated presence without aggression, and I took in the few seconds the walk afforded me, the specific tableau at the altar, Lily in $50,000 of custom silk, her hair done by someone whose waiting list I could name, my engagement ring on the hand currently gripping David's. David in a suit he'd purchased with money he'd stolen. While my parents in the front row, my mother in a hat she'd clearly bought specifically for the occasion, my father with the expression of a man who has recently become aware that a room he thought he controlled has developed its own agenda. Lily saw me first. The face went through several things in rapid succession, each one visible to everyone near enough to watch it happen, which at that point was most of the room. I object, I said, and let the word fill that space, the way the cathedral had been built to fill with sound. Absolute silence. Then Lily's voice, climbing fast into something that had left controlled far behind. Get her out! She was pointing at me with a hand wearing my ring, which I noted with a specific, private satisfaction. It was a comet seeped. She doesn't belong here. Security, remove her now. 2 of the venue's security staff took uncertain steps toward me and then stopped. Registering my own security, doing the rapid math that people do when they understand the room has more layers than the briefing they received this morning. I picked up a glass of champagne from the tray of a passing server who had frozen mid-step at the altar end of the aisle. Took a sip, set it on the end of the nearest pew. I own this cathedral, I said conversationally, for the room. Purchased it 2 weeks ago through a holding company. The venue contract you signed, Lily, is with an entity I control, which means the staff here are, technically, my staff. So if anyone is being asked to remove anyone, it's going to go the other direction. Lily's mouth was open around words that hadn't found their shape yet. I also bought your fashion brand, I said, this morning. 51% majority shareholder, effective 9 a.m., which means the company you built on my stolen money now belongs, in the majority, to me. David took a step forward, which surprised me, because I had assumed, correctly as it turned out, that he would understand the situation faster than Lily and adjust his behavior accordingly. Something in him, some residual performance of the man he pretended to be, apparently needed one more moment. Nora, he said, spreading his hands in a conciliatory gesture, someone who has talked his way out of things many times before. This isn't... let's not do this here. Whatever you think happened, we can talk about it, privately. Like adults. I don't need to talk to you, David, I said. I need you to stand there and watch something. I reached into my inside pocket and took out the flash drive. There was a panel on the wall near the altar, accessible via the vendor contract Rose's team had arranged, connecting directly to the cathedral's main AV system. The screen behind the altar, usually displaying tasteful floral imagery for exactly this kind of event, were about to display something else. I crossed to the panel, inserted the drive, opened the display file. Every screen in that cathedral changed simultaneously. The footage was silent, which somehow made it more effective. A corner store security camera, slightly grainy in the way of cameras that exist to catch shoplifters rather than document crimes, recording a street intersection at 11:47 on a rainy night 5 years ago. A car entering the frame from the left, moving at a speed incompatible with the conditions. A figure stepping off the curb on the right side of the screen, umbrella up against the rain, not seeing what was coming, the impact, 500 people in a cathedral making no sound at all. The car stopping, 2 figures visible through the windshield. The one in the driver's seat, Lily, hands over her face. The one in the passenger seat, David, already leaning forward, already in motion, the specific purposeful motion of someone who has made a decision and is implementing it, not panicking. His hands on the wheel, the car moving again, not toward the person in the road, away. I let it run twice, not because I needed to, because I wanted every single person in that room to have seen it clearly enough that there was no version of later where they could claim uncertainty about what they'd witnessed. The person on that road, I said into the silence, died before the ambulance arrived. Lily was driving. David was in the passenger seat. When Lily was ready to call for help, it was David who made the decision to leave. David who steered the car away from the intersection. David who drove them home and helped construct the story that put me in a maximum security prison for 5 years for a crime committed by the 2 people currently standing at that altar. Lily had her hands pressed over her mouth. The gesture looked, from where I was standing, less like horror and more like the specific physical response of someone trying to hold back something they know is going to come out regardless. David had gone completely still, in the way of people who have run out of improvised responses and are waiting for the room to decide what happens next. My mother was gripping my father's arm. My father was looking at his shoes. The arrest warrants, I said, to no one in particular, were filed yesterday afternoon. The cathedral door opened again, not dramatically this time, just efficiently. 4 officers moving down the center aisle with the unhurried certainty of people executing a task they have prepared for. Lily Chen, the lead officer said, stopping at the altar. You're under arrest for vehicular manslaughter and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Lily's first response was to look at David. David took a step back. That step, that single instinctive backward movement away from her in front of 500 witnesses and 2 police officers was perhaps the most honest thing he had done in 5 years, and I watched Lily understand it in real time, watched her face process what that step meant about every version of the last 5 years she had been telling herself. David, she said, and his name came out small in a way I hadn't heard from her before. He took another step back. The officers moved in, and Lily finally made the sound she'd been holding back since the screens changed, a high, ragged noise that had nothing of performance in it. poor shock at a reality that had finally run out of exits. She struggled, not effectively. $50,000 of custom silk is not designed for the kind of movement that resisting handcuffs requires, and the train of her dress caught under her own feet as they guided her away from the altar, and she stumbled, caught by the officer's grip before she fell, and was walked, crying, down the aisle she'd walked up minutes ago, past 500 guests who parted in absolute silence. David didn't make it to the door. A second team had come in from the side entrance, and I watched, from my position near the altar, as he was informed of his own charges, accessory to vehicular manslaughter, conspiracy, financial fraud, of the full weight of what he built and what it had been built on, delivered in the flat professional language of people who do this every day. He looked at me once across the cathedral before they walked him out. I looked back. I didn't have anything to say to him that I hadn't already said to the room, so I said nothing and watched them take him through the side door and turned back to the 500 guests who were sitting in complete silence in a cathedral full of white lilies, processing the gap between what they had arrived to celebrate and what they were leaving with instead. My parents found me in the vestibule. My mother was crying, genuinely this time without the performance quality the earlier tears had carried. My father looked like a man who has watched an avalanche. He triggered arrive at the bottom of the mountain and is only now fully understanding the scale of what he set in motion. Nora, my mother said, please, the lawyers we don't have. The legal fees alone are going to be... You have resources now, you could help. She's still your sister. She was in that car, I said. And you knew, not what David did, maybe not all of it, but you knew she was driving, you knew I wasn't. And you handed me that story anyway because losing me was easier than losing her. My mother opened her mouth. I spent 5 years in a maximum security facility for a crime I didn't commit, I said. While she wore my ring, while David spent my money, while you told people at dinner parties that it was a very difficult time for the family. My father made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I'm not going to pay for her lawyers, I said. I'm not going to make phone calls or pull strings or do anything that softens what's coming for any of you. I love this family completely, and it wasn't enough, and I'm done trying to make it be. I picked up my champagne glass from the pew where I'd left it earlier. I hope you find a way through it, I said, and meant it in the specific and literal sense of the words, nothing underneath it. But you'll find it without me. I walked out of the cathedral into the late morning light. The Rosa was waiting on the steps, which I hadn't expected, and which meant more than I had the words for in that moment. How do you feel? She said. I thought about it for a genuine moment because she was someone who deserved a genuine answer. Like I can breathe, I said, for the first time in 5 years. Like the weight is just gone, Rosa nodded. Good, she said, because we have a brand to rename and I'd like your opinion on the auctions before we file the paperwork. I laughed. It came out surprised, real, the specific laugh that happens when something is genuinely funny rather than performed. Now, I said. The fighting window closes at 5, she said, and I believed in efficiency. Lily received 7 years. The judge, in sentencing, specifically noted the deliberate nature of the cover-up, the 5 years of silence while an innocent person served time, and the financial exploitation of the victim's assets during her incarceration. She was assigned to the same facility I'd served in. I heard this secondhand from Rose's attorney who mentioned it without apparent irony. I didn't feel triumphant about that specific detail. I want to be honest about it because I think the easier version of this story wants me to feel satisfied by the symmetry. And I didn't exactly. What I felt was closer to a quiet, sad recognition that some people only understand what they've taken from someone else once the same thing is taken from them. I hope she learns what I learned in there. I genuinely do. David received 9 years, his sentence heavier for the active role the footage showed him playing, for the financial fraud, for the years of sustained deception. His attorney tried several angles during sentencing, and none of them landed the way he needed them to, because the footage didn't leave room for interpretation, and juries, it turns out, find it very difficult to forgive a passenger who steers. My parents lost the house to legal fees within 18 months, the defense attorneys for vehicular manslaughter and financial fraud case being the specific kind of expensive that no amount of careful budgeting absorbs gracefully. They moved into a small apartment in a part of the city they'd previously driven through without slowing down. My father took a part-time job. My mother, I heard, had a difficult first year adjusting to a life at a scale she'd never planned for. I didn't reach out, not from cruelty. I want to be clear about that. From the simple, carefully maintained boundary of someone who's finally learned the difference between love and obligation and chosen, for the first time in her life, to only carry the version that doesn't cost her everything. The rebranding launched 6 weeks after the wedding. Rosa and I stood on the balcony of the corporate office, which had previously been Lily's corner suite and was now something else entirely, watching the city below with the particular quiet of two people who have arrived somewhere they worked very hard to reach. Across the street, on the building that had served as an ad space for the fashion label since its launch, the new signage was being installed. Workers in high-visibility vests guided the letters into place one by one, the old name being replaced piece by piece with a new one. Mine. How does it look? Rosa said, not looking at me, looking at the letters. Like it belongs there, I said. It does, she said. We stood in the afternoon light for a while after that, not talking, which was something I had come to appreciate about Rosa, the particular quality of her silences, which were never empty, just comfortable. The silence of someone who doesn't fill space with noise just because the noise would be easy. I thought about a thin mattress in a grey room, about a magazine folded open on a prison bed, and a ring I recognized by its setting, and the year that had changed everything and taken more than I'd known I had to give. I thought about walking out of a gate with a cardboard box and finding a car at the curb instead of the family I'd served the sentence for. I thought about a corner store camera running its quiet loop for 5 years, keeping the truth alive until someone came looking for it. The last letter went up on the building across the street, my name in plain white letters against the sky. I picked up my champagne, touched it lightly to Rosa's. Now I said, let's get to work.